Thank you kindly. I just want to confirm, can everybody hear me? Am I
Yes,
audible?
audio is
Okay,
good.
excellent. No, thank you for that. No, I really appreciate it. Yeah, so today I'm going to try something new a little bit in terms of, instead of a classical roundtable, is to try and see whether we can make the whole audience part of the roundtable. So we'll see how it goes, but I hope and I trust it will work well. So the idea is not just to disseminate information or to give ideas or opinions out, but it's also to try and to learn from what the audience viewpoints are, etc. So it's really trying to be a two-way street, have an open discussion today regarding sort of the role of universities in the age of AI. And there's this big question, which is whether this idea of thinking versus delegation in terms of where universities will fit and where we currently fit in this current role of AI. Okay, so before I continue on to sort of more formal content, I just thought it well to just start off establishing just a bit of a baseline that everybody has a chance to just pause a little bit, and given the title of thinking versus delegation in the authority of the university's role in the age of AI, just to try and establish where we stand currently before we start the discussion. So I hope everything works well with the Mentimeter. So let's see. So the idea is that everybody, if you can, just join Mentimeter, or on menti.com, you can enter this code, and then you should be able to get to the participation. So let me just see if I click here, and if I paste it in the chat, it might be easier for everybody just to click on the link to take you to the Menti that we'll be engaging with. Okay, so let's see if that works. So the first question is really just asking the question in terms of, in a single word, what everybody would describe, what is a university? What makes a university university? What is the essential ingredient behind a university? And I think it's important just to pause a little bit here and just to say, I think it's important that we have clarity in terms of what a university is and what a university's role is. So thank you for that. So we've got the first participant out of 11, criticality. Let's see, where are the rest? Let's write some of them down as we go along. Excellent. So thank you. So I think we've done quite well. So this is just, and I want everybody just to hang on what your take is on this, and we'll come back to this hopefully towards the end, or we'll use this as a source of reflection towards the end of the discussion. The second question that I have is just in terms of, in one word, how would you describe the role of AI in higher education today? What do you think the role of AI is in higher education? Just your current state and your current expectations, current understanding. Nice, it's good. I like it. It's a good mix of enabler, erasure. It's support. Excellent. Facilitation. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's interesting. That's great. Great. I've got two more questions, and then we'll get into the grit of things. So but I think it's giving us a good idea. And then the next one is, in one word, what is your biggest concern about AI in higher education? If you have to say your biggest fear or biggest concern of AI. Placement, okay. No fault, misinformation. Excellent. Thank you for that. That's excellent. I love that. Thank you for that. Okay. So that's giving us a good idea. And then this is the last question that I would like to pose is, what are the essential ingredients for learning to understand? So not just to memorize things, but to really get to understanding. So this is allows for a bit more freeform typing here. But I mean, it's good just to pause and say, okay, so what are really the things that make us learn so that we can actually understand? What are the essential ingredients? And I think that's the last question I'm going to pose before we start moving towards thinking and reflecting. And I know this is very dependent on background. So I am an engineer, so I've got obviously quite strong opinions about certain things here based on a science or engineering STEM context. But I think the idea is just to explore what are the sort of things that make learning happen or understanding. So I'll give it another minute or two, and then I think we're getting some interesting. Change in criticality, medical skills. Meaningful engagement. Perfect. Great. Thank you. I think that gives us a very good idea. And so hopefully everybody's got their own baseline that they have as we go into this discussion. And hopefully by the end of the discussion, some of these baselines might have shifted or might have been reinforced, depending on where we stand and how the discussion goes. Okay. Where is this? Let's get to the next slide. Okay. So I'm going to start off the discussion just in terms of talking about what is sort of the core dilemma that we are facing at the moment. And there's this, in my view, there's this big question in terms of this epistemic authority that the universities, the typical role is that we are establishments of criticality. So it's not just having information, but it's critical information and information that is sort of trustworthy and that's sort of been ticked off to have withstood at least the scrutiny of evidence and debate, etc. So I think that's that aspect. And there's this question about the delegation of that towards AI, large language models, and that's happening. There's this sort of almost epistemic humility that universities face at the moment in terms of that some of that are essentially delegated towards large language models, and what is now our epistemic responsibility in this sort of era of AI, and what is the role of universities? There's this question about human judgment in terms of for us to be able to define, verify, and cultivate knowledge, and even steer meaning, etc. The role of human judgment in all of this, and the whole question about epistemic authority is also related to human judgment. Are we essentially maintaining that, or are we also eventually going to delegate that away towards AI? All of this is contrasted with the fact that there are promises with AI in terms of efficiency, personalization, scaling, and that's also the lure of AI in terms of engaging with it, that there's all these opportunities that are potentially there. But in general, the big picture, if one looks at it, in my views, is that the big risk is that universities face at the moment is that we end up losing our role as trusted guardians and understanding. And that is sort of I think the space and the state that we face potentially at this stage. For me, the important thing is to try and get clarity in terms of what the roles of universities are in this era. What are the things that we can see as sort of potential benefits from AI, and what are the things that we should maybe flag as really things that could sort of destroy our authority in this regard. In essence, there's this whole question about when it comes to epistemic authority, the ability to generate data versus the ability to filter data, for instance, and in what aspects universities and what focal areas universities will play in that regard. So that is in essence part of the concerns and part of the questions that are floating out there in terms of when it comes to this core dilemma. And I'm not saying these are the only core dilemmas, but I'm just putting a discussion on the table, also some points on the table of things that are at stake at this stage when it comes to AI in this domain. So to get some additional feedback on this, I just want to just get this up and running again. I just want to understand in terms of what, from your side as a panel, what do you think is the core dilemma of AI's impact on universities? If you can put up a single word that maybe hasn't been covered in those ones that I've put up in front, but just in terms of what would be constituted as a core concern or core issue that universities face with the impact of AI. So demonization of education, assessment, AI becoming the authority, power over knowledge, okay, mistrust. Plagiarism, okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so given that sort of these sort of core dilemmas that's been quality assurance, there's academic integrity, rapidness, mistrust. If you had to say in this sort of space, then what do you think is the core role of universities of the age of AI? If you had to give it as a single word, given all these disparities of assessment, accreditation, regulate, truth, empower, Excellent, thank you. So I think we've got a good idea. So there's a variety. There's accreditation, there's critical thinking, adjudicator, empowerment, adaptability, research, truth, innovation, regulation. So there's a number of aspects coming out. So that's great. Thank you for that. So I'm also fairly, based on the given feedback, also the strong opinion that our real role has shifted from what I would say sort of in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where universities had sort of a dual role. And the dual role was predominantly to make information and knowledge available, and then also to do sort of certification or accreditation. And in the last decade or two, with the advent of the internet and a lot of freedom of information, I think the role is predominantly shifted really just towards accreditation and and certification. And the reason I make this statement is that in most of the disciplines out there, is that most of the content is already freely available on the internet. For mechanical engineering, there are multiple degree programs that you could go and download from first year to the final year, with assessments available, etc., etc. The only thing that really, I think, in my view, and not everybody might agree with this, but it's fine, is that discerns a university at this stage is that we can, in essence, also certify that somebody has mastered those ideas and concepts and understanding to a certain level, so that there's a certain level of understanding and trust associated with that. And I think that's, for me, is a key aspect of what universities have become. This idea that our primary authority is in the fact that we do accreditation and assessment and certification, which also then implies to a large extent that our authority lies in our ability to assess properly and authentically and with integrity. Because if that assessment becomes flaky or that assessment becomes questionable, then we lose, in my view, our primary authority, and that is as a certification and accreditation body, which is why somebody would want to come to university to learn about engineering or about humanities or about law, as they could also do that from home, watching YouTube videos or engaging with online content, coursework. But the fact is that they would want to walk away with some form of certification, and that professional bodies rely on some form of oversight that people have mastered things to a certain level to ensure that chaos doesn't erupt in society. So that's the key aspect in terms of, and there's this assessment crisis that AI has brought onto us. For instance, with poorly designed assessments, AI puts a lot of things at risk. It can erode our credibility. There might be a huge loss in public trust. And then in the end, if we lose that assessment authority, we essentially return back to what we are predominantly then content providers. But that unfortunately makes us semi-obsolete in my view, because most of the content is to a large extent already available. There's still the role of research and creating new content. But in some of the fields that I'm working in, that is also largely shifted away from universities. For instance, a good example is AI research and large language model research, or any of this sort of AI research. Since the 70s, a lot of the cutting edge research has shifted out of the universities into the research and development units of private sector, just because of funding. So a lot of the universities are currently even struggling to really engage critically with the AI research, and are losing top tier talent in the AI research sector towards the private sector, because that's really where the funding and the money is to allow them to drive research that you can't even execute at university in the modern era. So there's all of these interplays, and there are definitely some sectors where research still play a big role at universities in terms of creating new knowledge. But as soon as that gets publicly disseminated, that becomes sort of publicly available. So for today, I decided to put the research debate aside. And I do think that universities still have a role to play in terms of creating new knowledge, although that's not the only place where that's happening. There might be multiple places where that is at play. But in essence, the certification has to mean something a lot, has to mean more than just completion. It has to somehow be able to hold that approval of verified understanding. And I think that is the key risk that we are facing at the moment at universities. It's just that our accreditation and certification are at risk of certifying completion of a task as opposed to making sure that we can verify and understand that somebody actually had that competence at the right level to be able to be certified accordingly. And that's part of the assessment crisis that we are facing, and that we as a university would need to solve. And we as staff in our schools, etc., would need to essentially facing at the current stage, and we'd need to try and see how we tackle that in a sensible way. So first off, just to set this to background, I've made now a statement about assessment and authority in education. That statement, apologies, that should have been no, the red one, not yes. So left, the blue is yes, and the right is no, and not sure in the middle. But just in terms of who would even agree with that statement, in terms of that assessment does represent largely our authority as university, and who would disagree. So please, the red, it does say yes at the bottom, but that's for no. So feel free to use that. And if you're not sure, you're welcome just to indicate not sure. The reason I'm asking this is if we don't think it's important, if you don't think it's a part of our authority, the assessment accreditation, then obviously the debate is quite different. But if the belief is that that is predominantly a big part of the role of what the university has to play and what gives us existence, then it's something that we need to fight for, and it's worth fighting for. And it might not always be easy and obvious in how to achieve that. Right, so we predominantly feel that thank you for that. And then I've got just another question. In your view, how can universities ensure AI-based assessments maintain credibility and trust? This is now a bit of a loaded question and a bit of a bomb drop, but I think it's an important question to ponder. If we agree that assessment is really part of our primary authority as a university, the question is, how do we do it, and what suggestions are out there in terms of doing it in such a way that we maintain our credibility and trust? So there's transparency, there's using AI, it's coming through. Test and retest, I like that. Yeah, critically review. Personal reflection. Like it's thinking, critical thinking coming through. Excellent. So thank you for that. And feel free to add more, please. I'll just talk a little bit. I think there's when it comes to AI-based assessments, there's also been a shift in universities, predominantly from, let's call it, the 80s or the 70s and 80s, when we were in an information scared society, where to get information you still had to walk a couple of kilometers to the local library to get information. There was a big part of generation of information that was sort of or reproduction of information, not even generating of new information, but just be able to reproduce or generate information was predominantly the mode of what universities' role were. So universities predominantly functioned as in a mode of, if you could do a calculation or if you could answer a question, the implicit assumption was that you also understood the work. And that is also clearly shown in the last 1 or 2 decades. That implicit assumption that if you can do something that you understand it is also quite broken. And that sort of led to all the memorization, et cetera, practices that some of the STEM disciplines are experiencing currently, sort of passing by memorization of exams as opposed to understanding the content. But that's sort of the generative sort of framework, I think, in terms of which universities tend to operate. And that's, I think most of us here are likely from that era. I myself am definitely from a generative era where we were celebrated when we could do a calculation, or we could reproduce something. Whereas I think the predominant mode in which universities need to operate and which students need to be able to be equipped is in a filtering capacity, not a generative capacity. So the role of the modern era is not really it's not the scarcity in finding information or the scarcity in reproducing information. It's in the ability to take multiple forms of information or conflicting information and filtering that. And what's nice about that is that it requires thinking, and that also enhances thinking. But I think in terms of when it comes to AI-based assessment, I'm of the view that just switching this mindset from a generative mindset rather to a filtering mindset opens up a lot of potential for reimagining assessments within a university context, such that we still maintain credibility and trust. And not just that, but also functional individuals once they leave university, because that's predominantly the world that they'll be living in, is a flooded world of information, not information scarce world. But that allows then essentially just a shift in a mindset that allows us then to maybe make assessments different. So simple examples are it's obviously a couple of hacks and stuff that one can try, but for instance, giving a student an assessment where there's known notes, and the first part of the assignment is find the flaws. That requires cross-referencing, or even engaging with AI, multiple AIs, to figure out what in those notes are right and wrong, and then afterwards maybe providing them with a correct set of notes. And those kinds of activities have worked wonders, where you almost confront students with conflicting information, and then the level of conflict, one can control the criticality. So if the conflict is quite obvious, then it's sort of low criticality, and that's sort of introductory material and for introductory years. But as you go up in the streams, that sort of conflict or that disparity between the information can become much more nuanced, and allows us to actually then control the criticality. But what I like is essentially the comments that are floating here is essentially speaking to that, in terms of summarizing it in a way that allows us to let students act in a filtering capacity as opposed to purely in a generative capacity. And I do think that's my view, the key thing to try and shift the credibility and trust in an AI-based assessment, is to try and find ways to get students to develop their filtering ability as opposed to their generative capacity. So almost to the ability that they need to be able to evaluate, not just to be able to create, but even to be able to evaluate content. That is predominantly the core skill. The benefit of that is it enhances thinking, but also is also the question in terms of what are good filters What are things that are working well as filters? And I think that's part of the the problem that a lot of students face in the modern era is if you sort of go by memorization through content and you try to get through courses and through content rather by primarily by memorization as opposed to by understanding, the huge risk there is essentially that that you can't use any of that as a filter. So you can't use an example as a proper filter. So typically if you have an idea or concept or principle and it's applied within a specific example, and all that you've done is essentially memorized or remembered that example doesn't translate well to another example. And that is I think that is part of the problem that a lot of students find stressful, is if they've gotten through some of the years, maybe on a more memorization based approach, as opposed to let's call it an understanding approach, they find themselves creating these silos of information. Like if I've learned about a mathematical concept in this course, in this context, then that mathematical concept is stuck to that context or that example. If I move to another field, apply the same mathematical principle, it becomes a new mathematical construct. It's not the previous one that's just applied to a new example. And I think that's part of the risk in terms of what students are facing from their side, where by shifting the focus towards filtering, elevates the thinking away from just the memorization component, but rather to the conceptual component and the conceptualization component, to make sure that there's an evaluation component associated with that, that actually then allows for transfer of these things between examples. But more importantly, they become essentially very valid and very useful filtering strategies. So concepts, principles are phenomenal filtering approaches, whereas examples are terrible filtering approaches. And that's for me the big risk at what I'm seeing currently at universities, and this is a worldwide phenomena, is there's a big drive from students to try and by memory get through courses and content. But that's the worst thing from a filtering approach. The best thing that a student can do is to say, I need to embrace and understand what's going on, and conceptualize things, because those are things that are generalizable between different examples, and that I can then use as an effective filter. But I love these responses that I'm seeing here, so thank you for that. Okay, let me just go on then. Okay, so what is a specific way that you believe AI is changing how we should assess students' understanding? So I might have maybe spoken a little bit to that in my rant, but just in terms of, just for some input from the audience, in terms of, for me, the big one is between filtering and generation. But I would love to see if there's any other responses, other inputs. Yes. Yeah. And I like the comment. It makes us ask what we're actually assessing our students. And that is, I think, the key thing that we need to confront ourselves with is what are we valuing and what are we assessing? Because in the end, the easiest way to think about assessment, in my view, is assessment is a value statement. So typically, what and how we assess is essentially expression of what we value, and what we communicate to students is what is being valued. I think that is critical. Yes, I like the thinking and the criticality. Application of understanding, so praxis approach. reflective essays, personal experiences. I think what's nice is there's a lot of room for creativity here. There's, as an example, what one of my colleagues did for one of the courses was a programming course, and in essence, it was clear that students were going to use AI. So what this colleague did was gave the students essentially a baseline AI generated solution, and they had to improve on that. So even if they then used AI to do that improvement, the fact was they had to sort of iteratively at least go through that process. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for getting students to build or co-create or extend or first create and then compare with AI. So there's a lot of opportunities in that regard, where it's not so much the generation component, but it's more the reflective or the filtering component that comes to fore. Excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you, colleagues. This is excellent. Okay. All right. So I think it's given us an idea. So we've spoken a little bit about the importance of assessment, ways in one could maybe approach assessment. And then I just want to throw it up a little bit more open in terms of there's opportunities on the assessment side, as long as we know what we're trying to achieve, and as long as we guide ourselves by principles of understanding and clarity. I think that's the key thing, and that is most likely the most difficult thing at this stage. Is there are multiple voices and multiple ideas, and it's great that there's multiple ideas, and its diversity is important. As long as we are steered and we have got clarity, I think, as opposed to sort of hoping and yeah, and have a lack of clarity in that regard. But I think in terms of AI in general, has a huge potential as a catalyst within the educational space. It can absolutely enhance our mission. So if, in my view, if AI is used responsibly and it's used correctly, it will make students think more, not less. It might make them do some of the mundane work less, but of the university level work and the work that we value and the thinking levels that we value, I think AI has a lot of potential to actually enhance that and to improve that, so that more time is spent thinking as opposed to less time spent thinking. In my own education as an engineering student, I would easily say about 60% of my time was spent practicing sort of high school or first year maths, even if in third and fourth year courses. And the amount of time that was spent thinking about the answers was a lot less. I think there's opportunity here that we can essentially, instead of asking students to solve only solutions, is to even provide them with answers, but to critique those answers, etc. Where that was sort of not at all what happened sort of back in the 90s and the early 2000s. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for enhancement of our mission as opposed to replacing it, so that we really get towards much more deeper conceptual engagement. And what's the key thing is, I think AI allows us to actually get students, and I'll talk to that in the next slide as well, allow us to actually get students to engage at a much, much deeper and a much more critical level than what one might be engaging with or what they might be engaging with currently, given the same amount of time. So I think when we think of the curriculum or think of courses and a degree program as a fixed amount of hours, the question is, how can we make those hours more efficient in terms of learning and growth, and not less efficient? And I think there's a lot of potential there. It for staff and for students, it frees up on time on what really matters. So for staff, it can be allow us to get more personalized feedback back to students. It might allow us to develop much more stronger critical thinking because you have more time. If some of our admin, etc., loads are taken off us, or if we use and utilize AI ourselves, we might free up some time so that we can engage more critically, even with our own courses and our own content. Like I say, personalization of content as well as personalization of feedback are all opportunities, I think, that allows us and students to actually engage much, much deeper with the content. So AI can really help us to extend our academic judgment. It can help to extend our diversity in which we need to apply that judgment, as opposed to just replacing it. And that sort of allows us to become better at filtering and develop better conceptual understanding, so that we are able to filter better than just merely generating content. And I think that is the key aspect for me in terms of how it can be really a catalyst in our learning environment. So just out of curiosity, in terms of just to throw something back to the crowd, how would you think AI can be used to enhance thinking? And you can put critical thinking in front. Thinking, for me, thinking and critical thinking are similar. So initial ideation. Great. So diversity of initial ideas. Great. Yeah. So that's filtering. Yeah. Critique. Yes. Biases. Yeah. Yes. So verification and validation. Yeah. Yes. Critical friend. Teach students to prompt. I love that, because that's, I'll talk to that now, because that's one of the things. Thank you for that. Ask deeper questions when conceptualizing. Yeah. And organize an idea. Yes. Perfect. I love this. Yeah. So there's if I look at this, there's two there's multiple things here, but there's two things that I just want to highlight. The one is the teach students to prompt AI to ask them follow-up questions, and I absolutely love that, because I've got quite strong opinions about where universities have traditionally and still currently lack often in our education of students is even in my own education. The first time I got to ask questions, really, in terms of or were encouraged to ask questions, and where in assessment that was encouraged, was really when I was doing postgraduate research. In the undergraduate curriculum, it's often this, here's the question, answer the question, here's the question, answer the question. There needs to be a shift that needs to happen, and AI is definitely an enabler there, that we develop the ability of students to ask questions, critical questions. And when I make that statement as well, is there is no real learning happening without a question. So every learning opportunity starts with a question. And then the quality of that learning opportunity is really related to the quality of that question. And I think there's a big opportunity for us to use AI to develop that ability of students to ask questions. So when I set tests and exams, there's always a section which is marks awarded for the questions that's asked, not for answers provided. And I think that's another opportunity to embrace potentially in AI. I'm not saying that's the only way to do it. That's sort of my own version of it, is to force students, after they've been confronted with some evidence, is to ask them what would be reasonable questions to ask, or what would be meaningful questions to ask, which questions would add the most value. And based on the criticality, then marks are awarded for that for students to try and get them to up their criticality. But I think there's a lot of opportunities in terms of developing that ability to ask questions, which is underdeveloped, in my view, predominantly at universities. And I think AI is a great opportunity for that, to do that. And then there's this idea of asking more questions when conceptualizing, then get organized ideas and polish. And in a number of these other ones, this idea of iteration is coming out nicely, in terms of it's not a linear process, but it is essentially, there's this idea of getting some data or getting some evidence, making sense of it, getting some data, getting some evidence, making sense of it. And I'll talk to that now, because that's quite an important aspect in terms of, I think, where AI has a big role to play. And then one word to ask that can be outsourced to AI for productivity, just out of box ideas. I mean, this is more just for colleagues to stimulate each other in terms of, for ourselves as lecturers and academic staff at the university, how can we use AI to make our own productivity higher and better so that we can focus more also on the thinking and developing critical assessments that will get students to think more critically. So it's just good to make sure that we don't exclude ourselves in this process, because in the end, it's every hour that we free up for ourselves is also an hour that is essentially potentially can be given towards time for students or towards research that we could develop. Point citations, paraphrasing, scenario generation, structuring, brainstorming. And I think the key thing is that that we as staff and academics engage with AI critically as well, that we also understand in terms of its co-creation and its role in terms of getting us to keep moving forward and keep developing. And I think that for me is a stunning thing about AI and generative AI is it's this continuous learning and self-development is immense, the potential with AI regarding that. Admin, great. Excellent. Editing. All right, thank you, colleagues. No, that's excellent. That is fantastic. And I think there's a lot of other opportunities in terms of you can use it to generate a initial assessment, or just to get diversity of assessment ideas, not necessarily questions, but just types of questions. So I think there's this meta level in terms of ways in which we could present content, not necessarily the content itself, but just in exploring options and opportunities in what are different ways in which one can explain an idea, or different ways in which one can visualize ideas. There's a lot of potential with AI regarding that allows us to continuously grow and develop ourselves as well. I think there's immense potential in that regard. Okay. All right. So then, in essence, there's this last one or two slides that I just want to talk about and cover in terms of how we can use AI. And I think based on the previous comments, this is sort of just summarizing some of that, and it's just trying to put it into clear terms, so that we can have a discussion about that. But it's, in essence, the question is really just in terms of how we can use AI to scaffold critical thinking, and not really just to automate outcomes. I think that's the key thing. This idea that we need to iterate, this idea that learning for understanding is not a linear process. It's a once-off process, but it's an iterative process. And I'm quite a firm believer in that. And it's for me, it's simply just based in our biology. You don't learn a language, or you don't build a neuron path, a dense neuron path in your brain by looking at something once. You need to look at it multiple times from different angles and different. So it's just, for me, from the biology of being human being, iteration is key for really deep understanding and critical thinking. And that's also why research is research. The RE means that we keep on doing it, because that iteration is so important. And so the question is, how do we design assessments that inherently requires iteration and reflection? And there's a lot of opportunities with AI, like we've spoken about. There's critiquing, there is multiple, generate your own content, compare with AI, co-create with AI, and see and do a comparative between all three versions. But any form where we can get students to iterate, reflect, and obviously we want to do quality iterations. The better the iterations there, the better that one might have. And then all of this is really empowers our oversight and our ability to verify. So this getting students so that they can filter and they can validate with certainty and with confidence, I think, is critical, so that we get our assessments, practices, etc., aligned with that. And then there's this question, is a simple way to do that not maybe just designing for praxis? And what I mean with praxis is not maybe the traditional term, but it's more talking about this critical thinking by iteratively combining reflection and actions. So if we can use AI in a way where we get students to make some actions with the AI or engage with AI or engage with content, reflect and re-engage, reflect, re-engage, reflect, then I think we in a much better position for winning this battle and actually getting most likely better outcomes than just the purely generative outcome of saying, can you generate some content, as opposed to having the ability to actually making sure that we can certify also that understanding is there, as opposed to that being a proxy like it used to be in the past. And then the question is how do we, if you want to leverage the power of AI with scaling, scalability, all that, how do we actually conduct online exams? And how do we actually make sure that we can proctor those exams? And I think there's a lot of ideas that one can throw around in that regard regarding, for instance, if you want to do online assessments with students all over the show, all over the place, can't we leverage the infrastructure in societies to assist us there? So, for instance, make use of police stations, make use of libraries as assessment centers that are decentralized. But I think the key thing is if one wants to have an online examination process where there's still trust and confidence in that an individual has this right understanding, then I think it would become important to try and explore these decentralized infrastructures. And there are some of these infrastructures that are under strain at the moment that might benefit from actually rejuvenation. And I think universities could play a role to try and help rejuvenate them as spaces for assisting us in doing assessments in an online fashion. Because I do think there's a lot of potential in these online examinations and online proctoring that I think is in the long term something that universities really need to try and spend time and energy on. Because if we solve that, it means we make all of this assessment and certification a lot more affordable, and means we unleash much more of the potential of the country than just the part of the country that can afford it, or that we're lucky enough to actually have opportunity at the university. Okay. Then I just want to ask this question in terms of if everybody has to ask, what is the one skill that you believe is essential for students to develop in an AI-powered world? For me, there's one clear thing here, but there's multiple. But I mean, there's quite a fundamental skill, I think, that critical thinking. And then the nice thing, and again, I'm going to make a statement here, not everybody might agree with it. I fully agree with the critical thinking aspect, and please continue typing there. But for me, critical thinking again starts with a question, exactly asking the right question. And I think the key skill is critical thinking, but it starts with a critical question. And so I think the key skill that we need to develop in students in an AI-powered world is for them to be able to answer. And I think if we reflect back, that's most likely the part that we, in my opinion, again, we do the worst job in as a tertiary educational institute. And I'm not talking about specific, I'm just talking in general at any university. This is the part that's the worst developed, most likely, at the end of a degree program, because that's typically not explicitly assessed, not explicitly encouraged to be assessed. It's all implicit. And I think by making that one component explicit, all of a sudden flips and changes the narrative quite drastically. That we start thinking about assessment, also developing questioning, not just generation of answers. And I think that's, for me, one of the key outcomes of how we can leverage AI and the benefits of AI. Then there's questions. Maybe I think we're going to run out of time. How we can get AI. So I'll go over these questions. We might not do it now in this session, but the question is, how can we use AI to get students to engage or iterate more? And how can we get AI to get students to be more focused during each iteration? So that it's not just iterations, but it is quality iterations and critical iterations. How can we enhance that focus? And I think there's opportunities to explore there, how we can use AI in those contexts. But yeah, so just to conclude, I think it's our shared responsibility that the university's role is a site of critical thinking, fair evaluation, and the stewardship of knowledge, which includes the development of new knowledge. But in essence, the question is not whether we use AI or not, but it's really just how we're actually going to be stewards of it in achieving our mission of critical thinking, fair evaluation, and generation of new knowledge. I think in this future-oriented AI integration, the values of equity, integrity, and critical engagement are three values, I think, that are simple to remember, but they're quite valuable in terms of guiding how and what we approach as we go along. And then I just maybe want to open up just for normal questions from the audience and to have a discussion. Apologies, this took a bit longer than expected. I was hoping there was going to be about 15 minutes for questions, but feel free to type questions and then we can take it from there. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, Prof. We don't have any questions in the chat right now, but we have a few comments on the Padlet. So just quickly opening it. So one question is just how different is AI and the impact of AI than the previous impact of technologies like the calculator or Google search?
It's a great question. So I think in terms of, for me, the current version of AI is essentially closer to a convenient version of Google search than what it is really on the thinking side. But it's going to change in the near future, where AI will start to reason and start to think. But I think the reality is it's like any technology that we develop in the world, is we learn to live with it and we learn to co-create with it. And that's really where the value add is and the value lies. With a calculator, I remember in the 50s, there were images, not that I was around then, but I saw images in America of the end of mathematics when calculators were introduced in schools. But the reality is there's obviously a risk in terms of, let me put it like this, there's some skills that will go down because of AI, but there's other skills that will go up. And I think as a university, we're in a position to help dictate what are the skills that go up. And if critical thinking is the skill that goes up, I'm all for using AI. Obviously, it can also be used in a way that it erodes critical thinking. But as long as we guide in terms of in a sensible way, so the question I think will still remain: if there are two engineers or two teachers or two lawyers, each with equal access to AI, what will differentiate them? And I think that is essentially that co-creation component where AI will. So I don't think it's in essence a necessarily a train smash, but it becomes more and more blurred what that distinction is. And I think that ability of asking questions, driving meaning, steering meaning, are more and more important, and less just the pure technical stuff. That's in short. Sorry. Okay.
Are there any other questions or comments people would like to make?
I just saw this one in the chat here. Is the university working on an AI policy for staff and students? I know that Mia has got one, and FEEB, we're working on one. I'm not sure at university-wide, but I do think, I'll say my opinion here, but again, it's just my opinion. I do think having a blanket AI policy is maybe not a good idea, but to rather think of it as over faculties, even over schools, because some of the schools might be different in faculties, to rather steer it at that level. One might have an overarching policy saying embrace or, AI, but I think there should be differentiation between faculties, but even between years. The way you use AI in first and second year should not be the same you use it in third and fourth year. And I think that's, especially if one wants to steer certain outcomes like critical thinking, etc., is that the clear policy in terms of how it's used and how it evolves from the beginning of the degree to the end of the degree. That's just my opinion.
People are posting in the chat that some schools and faculties do have their own policies.
Yeah. Yes.
So I think we need to wrap up now. First, just thanks, Professor Wilke. You raised
Sorry, Dom, there's a question. There's a question
Sorry?
on the chat
Oh, sorry.
from Parrot. As much as the unique value offering of units is the certified learning, the underlying offering is supporting student learning journey to reach certification. So the value of AI at university is less about assessment and more about learning, with assessment not being much more than documenting that outcomes have been achieved. Don't know if you want to comment on that.
Thank you for that. No, I appreciate it. Yeah, I think the if it's well designed, the learning and the assessment develop together. I mean, so I don't think they're necessarily just separate in terms of, because the assessment also is like I said, it's a value statement at the end. So as long as that value statement is aligned with our learning statement, then they are two different vehicles to achieve the same outcome. And I fully agree. Everything we do at the university is about developing critical thinking. The question is is assessment, is it done critically, or is it just done as a afterthought, or is it deeply integrated into that sort of learning process? And I think that deep integration into the learning process allows, again, for better iterations and better reflection. Because if you take out the assessment completely and the student is just going through the learning process without feedback, and the assessment doesn't always have to incorporate marks, but I mean, even if it does incorporate marks, it does allow for that lift of criticality. Because I think in general, when it comes to learning, a student would go through the material and think that they've mastered it until they've been assessed, and then realize I wasn't critical in certain aspects, and then have a chance to develop that criticality. Because that needs to be sort of in an iterative fashion that you develop that criticality. As sort of when we are engaging with content the first time, like playing golf, we might overestimate our abilities completely, and we might estimate the difficulty that's involved. And I think assessment is a way to ground that learning experience. That's my view on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Great.
I particularly enjoyed being able to see the views of everybody in the room flashing up
Yes.
on Mentimeter during this. So thank you for that. We are running slightly late, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks once more, Professor Wilke. And for everybody else, we have a short break. And at 3 o'clock, we are joining the next set of sessions. The links are in the program. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.